It say, Judge, your plate is on the table.
Good evening, brothers and sisters, friends and comrades. I want to welcome you to this teaching webinar, Paying Humanity's Debt, Cuba, the Caribbean, and Africa. I'm Cleve Andrew Pulley. I'm a former anti-war soldier, anti-Vietnam War soldier, one of the Fort Jackson 8. I'm a recently fired, unjustly fired Walmart worker. I'm a member of the DC Metro Coalition in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. This event is in honor of Malcolm X's birthday, Ho Chi Minh, and others as well. And on the 29th of May, it'll be the birthday of Maurice Bishop as well. The DC Metro Coalition in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution, along with the Sao Paulo Forum and others, organized a protest or a solidarity action on May 7th at the Cuban Embassy here in Washington, D.C. The action was called to condemn the terrorist shooting into the Cuban Embassy on the 30th of April in the wee hours of the morning. 32 shots was fired. Luckily, no one was hurt or killed, but the building was damaged. This action was carried out by a deranged person. As additional facts came to light due to the Cuban investigations, it has been revealed that this gentleman was not just some loose individual, confused person, but he had hung out in Miami with friends of the Vice President Pence and friends of Senator Marco Rubio, who were very, very virulently anti-Cuban revolution. He traveled many, many miles from Texas to Pennsylvania to Washington, D.C. over a 2 weeks period of time. Although he was homeless, had no job, somehow he had funds to carry out this travel and to purchase weapons that he used to fire into the embassy. He also was found with cocaine in the vehicle. In any case, the President of the United States, who frequently cannot keep his mouth shut about anything, have not denounced this action whatsoever. And the U.S. authorities took them over a week to even report any of their findings to the Cuban authorities. So all kinds of questions are raised. In any event, the hostile action of the United States against the Cuban Revolution going back from the very beginning, the more than 500 terrorist attacks against Cuba since 1959, over 600 attempt to assassinate its leaders over the years, the constant aggression underway now, the sanctions, the travel restriction, the continuous effort to bring about and then to overthrow the regime, the Cuban government, All of this made it appear okay to this guy who fired the shot. But we should keep in mind that the chief culprits in this act is the United States government and Congress. Congress and the president equally responsible for fomenting this situation. In addition to this, the protest solidarity event we held on the 7th of May condemned the Bear Pig defeated type, the Bear Pig type invasion, which was defeated by the Venezuelan fishermen and soldiers and security personnel on May 3rd. Again, here it is clear from the year-long effort to overthrow the Venezuelan government and the $15 million bounty that Trump have put on the head of President Maduro, greatly inspired these folks, and it's becoming pretty clear that Guaido, the would-be puppet president of the United States want to impose in Venezuela, signed an agreement with the perpetrators of this mercenary act. In any case, both this was defeated decisively and quickly. Again, but here we should hold the United States government itself responsible for that. So at the rally in the picket line we held, we demanded, among other things, U.S. hands off Venezuela, get out of Guantanamo, stop the sanctions, lift the sanctions, and so on. Let me just make this point. We have been forced by the crisis brought on by the government ineptitude and the social danger of the COVID-19. But we have had many different webinars where we have spoken forcefully in defense of Cuba and Venezuela against the United States aggression. While the world tried to fight off this COVID-19, the United States government is busy as ever, if it is not escalating its sorties of assault on Cuba, Venezuela, and others through sanctions and whatnot. And while Cuba gives selfless aid to any country and all countries, the United States carry out its imperialist aggression. So with that, I just want to end and urge all of you in your local area to figure out a way to get out and speak out publicly against the U.S. assaults. My task is to introduce our two co-chairs. I'm going to just mention both of them and then hand it over to Kennedy when I'm done. Along with Kennedy Giffinger, who is from the Universal Zulu Nation Hip Hop for Humanity Committee and other organizations. She'll be co-chairing the meeting with August Nimps, who is a co-chair of the Cuba Coalition in Minneapolis, and also a professor at the University of Minnesota. So with that, I will turn it over to Kennedy. You got the floor, Kennedy.
Peace, family. Very honored to be here. So welcome to the International Conference for the Normalization of U.S.-Cuba Relations. Welcome to this webinar and teach-in special, Paying Humanity's Debt, Cuba, Africa, and the Caribbean. What is the International Conference for the Normalization of U.S. and Cuba Relations? It was a planned conference in March of 2020 in New York City, but due to the COVID-19 outbreak, it has been rescheduled to November 2020. Visit the website, www.us-cuba-normalization, all one word, .org for more information in regards to the work that they're doing, as well as the rescheduled conference. And I'm going to pass this over to my lovely co-host as well, August, to give you more information about what the webinar will be about.
Yes, thanks very much, Kennedy. It's a real honor to have been invited to co-chair this event. Again, Paying Humanity's Debt, Cuba, Africa, and the Caribbean. Many years ago, I lived in Tanzania between 1969 and 1970. And Tanzania was the headquarters for the Southern African Liberation Movement. And that's where I learned about Cuba's contribution to Africa's liberation. I had the good fortune to have a neighbor, Walter Rodney, and it was Walter and other people in Tanzania who helped to explain to me the significance of what the Cubans were doing. So it's a real honor to be asked to co-chair today's event. We have a program featuring many speakers, and the reason why we have many speakers is because many people wanted to pay their debt. They wanted to praise what the Cubans have done. And so the program may be a bit long, and we'll ask our speakers to abide by the times we've asked them to speak, so we can get through this so the audience can submit its questions. And so without further ado, by the way, we do have a program featuring speakers, and those speakers will open up. After the speakers, there will be a question and answer period. And throughout the program, you can type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of their screen. We're excited to be concluding the program with the singing of the international and video of Cuban May Day of 2019. So I'd like to turn it back over to Kennedy, who will introduce our first speaker.
Alrighty, so I'm happy to introduce Ana Silvia Rodriguez, who is the permanent representative of Cuba to the United Nations. Ana Silvia will also be introducing other ambassadors, Julia Iman Shenduru, who is representative of Namibia to the United Nations. So the floor is yours, Ms. Ana Silvia Rodriguez.
Thank you, Kennedy. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer of this webinar that put a lot of, not only a lot of effort, but I think you put a lot of your heart to have this seminar today. You cannot select a better day. As the previous speaker mentioned, Mr. Pulley, today we celebrate the birth of Malcolm X, we celebrate the birth of Ho Chi Minh. But today also in Cuba, we pay tribute to our national hero, Jose Marti, that died a day like today in combat for the freedom of Cuba. Marti transcends the boundary of Cuba, and he's a citizen of the world. And we Cuban, and this seminar, as I said, you cannot select a better day, because we are Cuban are working on one of the premises that Marti said, that homeland is humanity. So because of that, we are giving bringing to other peoples or to other countries health and hope. And because of this is the thing of this seminar today. So that's why the Cuban people and the Cuban government decided to share and to help other countries in the fight, not only against COVID, but also to improve the health quality of their population. The history of Cuba and the Caribbean and Africa are closely intertwined. We cannot talk about Cuba without mentioning Africa and the Caribbean. The struggle for freedom, the independence, the struggle for the dignity of the people we inherit from Africa. Because we cannot forget that hundreds of slaves, when they arrived to our shores, they decided that they prefer to flee or to offer their life before to surrender to the white master. So the Cuban nationality cannot be separate from Africa and the Caribbean. Of course, we are a Caribbean country. So it's very important then this connection, and that we feel very proud. We have to say we feel very proud of our African, the part of the nationality that Africa brings to the Cuban nationality. It's my pleasure now to introduce one of the speaker. She's from Namibia. the relation between Cuba and Namibia is more than a simple friendship. I think that we can call a brotherhood that was forged in combat, but also in peaceful cooperation. So it's my pleasure to present now not only a friend, but also a committed diplomat from Namibia, a very committed diplomat with the cause of third world in the United Nations. So I'm going to also, Julia, make a brief presentation of Julia. As you mentioned, Julia Jimenez Chanduro, she is the deputy permanent representative of the permanent mission of Namibia to the United Nations. She started her posting here in 2018. Julia holds a master in international service from the American University in Washington, D.C., and a bachelor degree in economics from the University of Namibia. She also holds certificates in conflict resolution, negotiation, and mediation, doing diplomacy in the age of a global governance in Vienna Diplomacy Institute, master in negotiation, building bridge across boundaries in Harvard, among others. She was deputy director in the office of the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, dealing with multilateral issues. So without further ado, Julia, you have the floor.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you, Anna. And thank you for inviting me to form part of this panelist. I'm greatly honored. And Anna has given a prelude to the relationship between Africa and the Caribbean, and Cuba in particular. And I wanted to just give you a brief history of the relationship between Namibia and Cuba. Cuba and Namibia have a long and fraternal relationship, one which is based on strong friendship and solidarity. The relationship continued after the attainment of Namibia's independence, with Cuba assisting Namibia in socio-economic areas. The relationship between Cuba and Africa is premised on true partnership, friendship, humanitarian values, solidarity, and South-South cooperation. During the liberation struggle of Namibia for Namibia's independence, Cuba assisted the people of Namibia when the apartheid South Africa massacred Namibians at Kasinga in 1978. It was the Cuban internationalists who were 16 kilometers away that came to the rescue of Namibians. They treated the survivors and took about 600 children to Cuba to receive treatment, after which 2 schools were set up for them. Many of those educated there are now playing important roles as cabinet ministers, members of parliament, captains of industries, among others. Cuba, together with Angola and the SWAPO combatants, fought side by side, defending the sovereignty of Angola. This joint effort resulted in a defeat of apartheid South Africa at the Battle of Quito Guanaval that resulted in the implementation of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 435, which called for free and fair elections in Namibia. These elections were won by SWAPO, and thereby forming the first independent government of the Republic of Namibia. Cuba was one of those countries outside Africa that contributed enormously to the liberation struggle of Namibia. After independence, Cuba and Namibia signed a joint permanent commission on cooperation in the fields of education, scientific, economic, sports, and health. In 2015, this agreement was revised to a joint working group to strengthen political and economic relations. That joint working group meets alternately in each other's capitals. They met last year in Cuba, and they will meet this year, provided that the COVID eases up in Windhoek, Namibia. This friendship continues to date. Namibia in 2017 hosted the 5th Continental African Conference on Solidarity with the government and the people of Cuba. This conference was aimed to strengthen the bonds of friendship with Cuba by recognizing the important work done by Cuba based on solidarity actions and reaffirming historical and cultural links between Africa and Cuba. Equally, Namibia maintains a Namibia-Cuba Friendship Association that is very active. Namibia understands the situation that Cuba faces internationally, particularly on the financial, economic, and commercial embargo. Therefore, at the United Nations and at any international forum, Namibia supports unequivocally and on an annual basis the implementation of the resolution entitled A Necessity to Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. As we have done for decades, Namibia stands by and reiterates our firm and unwavering support for the people and the government of Cuba, more particularly for the lifting of the financial, economic, and commercial blockade. Namibia's foreign policy advocates for friendship to all and an enemy to none. However, we do not forget the friends who stood by us during our difficult days of the liberation struggle. Lastly, I want to express our solidarity with Cuba during this time, when Cuba continues to send health personnel all over the world to fight COVID-19. Recalling that Cuba was amongst the first country to respond to the earthquake in Pakistan, the earthquake in Haiti, and the Ebola outbreak in West Africa by sending personnel and in the spirit of solidarity with limited resources. This is the debt Cuba pays to humanity. I thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for your touching words. Next, we're supposed to have the ambassador from Angola. She really wanted to be here, and even she apologized for not being in this webinar. But the mission of Angola is in the process to changing the server of their computer, so they didn't have computer just right now. That's the reason why she cannot engage with us today. But the ambassador of Angola sent me her intervention, and she asked me to read it. Ambassador of Angola, Maria Jesus dos Reis Ferreira. Well, you see the photo of her. Even she fought in Angola. She fought in the clandestinity. She is a retired Army brigadier from Angola Armed Forces, and she was awarded with 11 of November first class. There is a gold medal by the presidential order for her participation in the fight for the independence of Angola. Also, she was ambassador. She had different positions in different countries. She was ambassador of Angola in Austria. She also was a consul general in Portugal. She was director of the African and Middle East division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So she has a very quiet curriculum. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read it all, but I'm going to read to you her presentation. And again, she asked me to apologize to all of you for not being here today. It reads, at the outset, I would like to thank you for the invitation extended to my on behalf of my country to share a few remarks on the cooperation between the Republic of Angola and the Republic of Cuba. As you might recall, Cuba played an important role for the independence of the Republic of Angola through the military support of the Cuban internationalists, as well as in the period that followed the independence. Diplomatic relations between Cuba and Angola were established the 15th of November 1975. The following year, in February 1976, the first agreements in the field of defense, health, and education were concluded, essentially comprising the training of Angola cadres. At that time, the first Cuban teachers who contributed to the literacy campaign were dispatched to our country. About 18,000 Angolans were trained by Cuba in various specialties, who currently contribute to the development of Angola in a different areas and occupy leadership position in the state apparatus. Cuban military assistance was decisive in the celebrated Battle of Quito Cuanavale that took place in the Angola province of Cuando Cubango from 15 November 1987 to 23 of March 1988, at a time when Angola was defending itself from external aggression carried out by the defense and the security forces of the Republic of South Africa, which it fought in aid of UNITA's opposing force. The battle led to the signing of the New York Agreement on December 22, 1988, between the government of Angola, Cuba, and South Africa, allowing the independence of Namibia and the liberation of Nelson Mandela. Recognizing the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 435 of 1985 of December of 1978, which required the phase and total withdrawal of the Cuban revolutionary forces from Angola territory, as well as the affirmation of the principle of sovereignty, equality, independence of all people, and no interfering in the internal affairs. Those facts led to the peace accords for Angola that was signed on May 31st, 1991, between the government of Angola and UNITA under the mediation of Portugal. The Vicese Accord, that is the peace accord, foresaw the holding of general elections, which took place in 1992. That marked the institutionalization of the multi-party system and the market economy, the demobilization of part of FALA and FAPLA military personnel, and the creation of the unique army designated by the Angolan Armed Force. The two states institute on a bilateral level the Angola-Cuba Intergovernmental Commission as a consultation mechanism through regular and alternate meetings to monitor the implementation of the agreement. This cooperation was further boosted with the visit into Cuba in July 2018 by His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, during which different agreements were signed in different areas. The 4 agreements allowed Cuba participation in the implementation of the 2018-2022 National Development Plan of the Republic of Angola, which contains strategic development policies and programs of action. Today, more than 2,000 Cubans work in the 18 provinces of Angola, about 2,000 in the education sector and around 800 in the health sector. With the current pandemic situation of COVID-19 declared by the World Health Organization, within the framework of the existing relation between Angola and Cuba, 2,050 Cuban doctors have scaled the Angola capital to support the medical teams deployed in all municipalities in the country. The support will also consist of training Angolan doctors to treat patients who have contracted the novel coronavirus. On the blockade to Cuba, Angola have voted in favor of resolution which has just been approved by the General Assembly, since it considers that the persistence of the unilateral coercive measures imposed by the United States against Cuba as an unfair and reversing measure that inflict serious damage to the Cuban economy with serious consequences for its people, especially those who are most vulnerable. The blockade to Cuba has impeded the full realization of economic and social development, and consequently the full enjoyment of basic human rights, including the right to development, sustaining healthcare and social services, which will certainly affect the implementation of the National Economic and Social Development Plan of Cuba and negatively impact the Sustainable Development Objective of the Agenda 2030. To conclude, I reiterate that Angola and Cuba continue to share historical, political, diplomatic, economic, and cultural ties that fortunately the two states and people have been able to preserve for several decades on basis of mutual respect and reciprocity of advantages. Thank you. Over to you, Kennedy.
Oh, wow. Phenomenal, phenomenal. Thank you again, ambassadors, and everything that you've said. So we are moving on to our first panelist, who is going to be Dr. Rosemary Neely, who is an educator and longstanding activist for peace, social and economic justice. Dr. Neely's work...
But only by...
Dr.
Estoy en un seminario virtual.
Sorry, if you could just mute your mic, thank you. Dr. Neely's work is involved in the Cuban Revolution, including living and working in Cuba, awarded a Friendship Medal by the Council of State of the Republic of Cuba, author of Fidel and Malcolm X, Memories of a Meeting. Rosemary is a member of the board of directors of IFCO/Pastors for Peace and the New York, New Jersey, Cuba Seas Coalition and National Conference of Black Lawyers. I am proud to present Dr. Rosemary Neely.
Well, thank you very much, Kendra. It's nice to meet you. I would just like to thank the organizers and to welcome all of the viewers out there who've taken the time to participate in this webinar. So today, May 19th, would have been the 95th birthday of El Haj Malik El Shabazz, Malcolm X. And there are many indicators which can be identified when we study how Malcolm's political evolution was transformative. There were also intertwined social influences that had an enduring impact on both his philosophical beliefs and his actions, often overlooked relative to the question of gender, beginning with his mother and later his political relationships with politically active Black women and other women of color. And I must say here to include our sister, Yuri Kochiyama, who activist Asian American sister, who many of you may recall photographs of this woman cradling Malcolm's head as he was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom. So his sensitivity and his respect were essential. Today was Yuri's birthday also. Combined with this sensitivity and respect were essential in his transformative ideas, and that's all validated as well when we study his political relationships with leaders on the African continent, the Caribbean, Asia, and Latin America. In September of 1960, when President Fidel Castro and other members of the Cuban delegation arrived to the 15th United Nations General Assembly, and they're subsequently moved to a 10-day stay at Harlem's Teresa Hotel, the now infamous meeting between Fidel and Malcolm X was not the beginning of the Cuban nation's solidarity between African Americans and the people of Cuba, but rather it represented a continuation of the then over 100-year-long history of a solidarity born in the enslavement of African people in Cuba and the United States, and the fight against it, which is central to the latter and factually supports the assertions that since the very beginning of the Cuban Revolution, there were open and clear linkages between the Black liberation movement in the United States and the Cuban leadership. Malcolm solidified those bonds when he met Fidel. The symbolism and importance of that meeting must never be dismissed. When they arrived from the island, the delegation was to stay at the Hotel Shelburne on 34th Street in downtown Manhattan, refusing to accept exorbitant and what they termed, quote, unreasonable financial demands imposed on them by the less than hospitable hotel management. Fidel threatened to set up tents on the grounds of the United Nations. Progressive organizations and community folk in Harlem heard how the Cubans were being treated. So an invitation was extended. A stay was arranged for them to come uptown and stay at the Hotel Teresa. The invitation was accepted. And as a sidebar, and according to the late civil rights attorney Conrad Lynn, financial support was acquired from one of Harlem's notorious bookies, Bumpy Johnson. With the hotel costs secured, the delegation's invitation to Harlem was sealed, and they all checked into the Hotel Teresa on 125th Street. Political work about the revolution was also occurring in the United States and specifically in New York. There was a base of support for the revolution, which was strong amongst Blacks and their Black Cuban sisters and brothers, especially other members like the Puerto Rican community, the Panamanians, and of course, the Cubans who lived in Harlem. The Cuban leadership understood very early, from the years of Eisenhower, that the Black movement provided a base for the progressive anti-imperialist forces to neutralize the draconian plans of the intelligence agencies. As a victim himself of local federal and CIA intelligence, Malcolm understood this firsthand. So there was this mutual correlation of distrust that gave context and rationalization for why the Cubans accepted the invitation in the first place to move the delegation to Harlem. It would also be exposed as an international stage the hypocrisy of the United States government, who professed the sanctity of equality and individual liberties while simultaneously neglecting the civil rights of its own African-American population.
Okay, good.
To American political elites, Castro's move was nothing more than a political stunt. Nevertheless, in a context of Cold War bilateralism, this could be interpreted in no other way as a public relations disaster for the United States government. So it was just before midnight on the 19th of September, 1960, that Fidel met with Malcolm X upstairs in Fidel's hotel room. So during the meeting, the two leaders covered topics including racial discrimination in the United States, US-Cuban relations, Fidel's plans for his speech to the United Nations General Assembly, and furthermore, at the time of the meeting, racism and race relations in the United States were at a boiling point, compounded by tense Cold War politics. So Fidel's speech at the United Nations and his meeting with Malcolm X thrust what was known as the Black problem in America front and center onto a volatile international political landscape. In one part of the conversation where Fidel is discussing the impact of the negative propaganda and the already attempts by the US to undermine the revolution, Malcolm told the Cuban leader, no, quote, "No one knows the master better than his servants. We have been servants ever since we were brought here. We know all his little tricks. Understand? We know what he's going to do even before he does it," end of quote. So what Malcolm and Fidel Castro actually discussed that night may be interpreted as being of little importance, but what is important when one considers the symbolism of the two anti-imperialist and anti-racist leaders, one Black, one white, metaphorically locked arm in arm in the sanctuary of this 9th floor suite of Hotel Teresa, while a vortex of Cold War and racial conflagrations burned outside the window of all of Harlem and on the streets of America's cities, as well as across oceans and distant lands. So from the 19th to the 28th of September, until they returned to Cuba, Harlem was their home and the community was both host and the protectorate of the delegation. In a gesture of worker solidarity after being snubbed by President Eisenhower, who held a state dinner for leaders attending the General Assembly, Fidel and the delegation hosted their own banquet-style luncheon for all of the employees in the hotel. So the two leaders never met after that night of the 19th. Malcolm became increasingly focused on international activism in the last years of his life, writing about the Black struggle and anti-colonialism as a shared intercontinental project and making well-received visits to Africa and the Middle East. He was never able to fulfill accepting Fidel's invitation to Cuba because his life was cut short by the assassination. However, the legacy of the meeting has been fueled by concrete actions on the part of those here in the United States whose lessons of the true meaning of internationalism and solidarity has been infused in our struggle through the teachings of Malcolm and Cuba's role through the state apparatus in internalizing Malcolm X, the man, the leader, and his philosophy. Malcolm was also supposed to meet Che Guevara on December 1964 when Che was in New York to address the UN, but due to threats from right-wing Cuban groups in the United States, Che was forced to cancel a visit to Harlem. So it is undisputable that the meeting between El Haj Malik El-Shabazz and President Fidel Castro Ruiz positioned Malcolm to be respected amongst not only Black Americans, but that respect was evident in the Caribbean and other especially among other Latinos, are leaders in the Puerto Rican independence movement and anti-racist forces. In addition, the liberation movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America all recognized and saw how powerful his personality was to be known and recognized as an international leader, specifically the meeting between him and Fidel. And the images of those two leaders together is like a hallmark. It's like a sealed kinship between Black America and the people of Cuba. Fidel leading a nation engaged in a revolutionary process that challenged the before historical, cultural, political, and economic stronghold, which Malcolm knew how the United States had claimed Cuba as its own backyard for exploitation, not only in Cuba, but the regions and all regions throughout Latin America. The Malcolm X Fidel Castro encounter was historical because it brought to light the interrelatedness of African Americans in the Cuban revolutionary nationalism, while sowing the seeds for ideological and political ties between progressive US Blacks and Cuban revolutionaries. In closing, when Malcolm X went to the Hotel Teresa to meet Fidel, it was an important and historical meeting. If you look at the two men coming together, it was not the highlight of Fidel coming to Harlem, but in essence, the meeting attested to the keen sense of history that both of these leaders recognized, and their understandingness of the oneness of the struggles of the African-American people, the people of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, particularly Cuba, with its large population of African descendants. So by meeting with Fidel, Malcolm X told white America that Black people were ready to contextualize their struggle as part of an international fight against oppression, in which violence and class-based socialist consciousness served as the main instrument to liberation. So here we could go so far as to imply that Malcolm recognized that Cuba, under the leadership of Fidel, like so many other leaders in developing countries following successful liberation struggles, implemented socialism as the economic system to aid in the liberation of its people. So despite the more than 60-year-old blockade, the symbolic nature of that 1960 meeting has been manifested through numerous examples of friendship and solidarity between the peoples of the two nations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosemary Neely. Before we move on to our next panelist, there is a question that is on the floor. We are holding all questions until the end, but we do have a question for Ambassador Julia Chanduro, and she's not able to stay for the entire meeting, so I do want to ask this question before she signs off. So there is a question that says, is it possible politically for there to be an African Union declaration / resolution asking for the lifting of the blockade against Cuba? And this is going to Ambassador Julia Chanduro.
In fact, the AU continuously calls for the lifting of the blockade against Cuba by the US government. This was reaffirmed again this year in February during the Heads of State and Government Assembly in Addis this year. So this is an issue and a continuous issue that is on the table of the AU Commission. And then the African member states individually also continue to call on the lifting of the blockade against the people of Cuba. This has impeded the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And then we see this as an important factor for the development of Cuba and for sustainability, for peace, for economic growth, and so on. So this is something that has been on the table of the AU for so many years.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass this over to my co-chair, August Nimson. He can introduce the next panelist.
Thanks so much, Kennedy. And as an appropriate follow-up to Rosemary Neely's very, very informative presentation, I have the honor to introduce Mwalimu Keta. Mwalimu is an organizer for the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And the All African People's Revolutionary Party has been one of the long-term supporters of the Cuban Revolution and in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution here in the United States. So, Mwalimu.
Maybe we'll come back to Mwalimu, and we'll move on to our video from the Fernando Gonzalez that he was able to send to us in regards to him not being able to attend right now. And if our fellow colleague could show that video and share it with us, that would be great. It was showing and then now it's not. So just making sure for the end. There you go.
Dear friends, brothers and sisters, to talk on Africa, it's always inspiring to Cubans. It's the mother continent from which all of us came from. To talk also on the occasion of Malcolm X's and Ho Chi Minh's birthdays and the anniversary of Jose Marti's death, it's an immense commitment to me. So, what could I say that would be worthy of your interest and attention? When Fidel visited the United Nations for the first time, I was kicked out of the hotel he was staying at. He had two choices: pitching a tent at the United Nations courtyard or heading for Harlem. He immediately decided and said, I will go to Harlem because that is where my best friends are. And I do affirm that Afro-Americans have been the most supportive and faithful friends of Cuba in the United States. We all know how much mankind owes to Africa. With profound sorrow, humanity carries the pain for the 12 million Africans who were torn from their homes and taken in chains to Western Hemisphere to work as slaves on plantations, not to mention the millions who drowned or perished during the trip. Cuba, a small island in the Caribbean, has strong and unbreakable links to Africa. The international medical support Cuba provides to other countries is a topic generally ignored by corporate control media. More recently, it is even the subject of a rogue attack by the United States government. Since Cuba sent a medical brigade to help victims of the earthquake that struck Chile in 1960, until last year, 2019, the country has sent more than 600,000 specialists in 160 nations in order to assist in the field of healthcare, mostly free of charge. During the first years, assistance was given primarily to those countries that were fighting for their liberation and that in turn presented critical health situations. Thus, two of the most important medical brigades went to Guinea and Tanzania. Between the 1970s and the 80s, the greatest impact would be concentrated in Angola and Ethiopia. Out of those figures I commented earlier, in 2020, 28,000 specialists are still working in 59 countries. Thousands of African professionals and technicians have already graduated at our educational centers. Furthermore, thousands of Cuban civilian cooperators, including doctors, nurses, dentists, healthcare technicians, professors, teachers, engineers, and other professionals and skilled workers have rendered international services in Africa. I am myself very proud to have served in an internationalist mission in Angola from 1987 to 1989. Cuban soldiers and officers have been on duty services or have fought in that continent voluntarily and selflessly, hand in hand with African soldiers for their national independence and against foreign aggression. From African soil, Cuba has only taken back home the remains of our fallen sons and the honor of a duty accomplished. In the 1990s, the comprehensive health program was developed and put in place, which gave a more effective approach to the assistance provided by Cuba, including on it the medicines, medical equipment, and personal training. The confrontation of natural disasters from the hurricanes that hit Central America and Haiti in 1998 and 99, counted on the deployment of medical brigades made up of hundreds of specialists that enabled greater efficiency in healthcare work. A most specialized healthcare unit was created with the Henry Reed Brigade in 2005. Its services were offered to the US government to face the effects of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and then President Bush didn't accept these services. But the brigade has carried out missions to 22 different countries until 2019, and in the period between 2014 and 15, played an important role in controlling the Ebola outbreak in Africa. On the other hand, for the education and training of health personnel by Cuban specialists, between 1976 and 2005, Cuba founded 10 medical schools, especially in Africa. To this would be added the creation of the Latin American School of Medicine in 1999, which has graduated, together with other universities, 36,962 doctors from 149 countries, including the United States. This effort has been made possible by the policy developed in Cuba, which today has 95,000 doctors and 84,000 nurses, together with an international biotechnology industry. Despite blockade the US has imposed on us for almost 6 decades, Cuba has managed to have 1 doctor for every 9 inhabitants, an infant mortality rate of 4.9 per 1,000 live births, and a life expectancy of 78.45 years, all of which are indicators shown by developed countries. Cuba's indicators are even better than those of the United States, the very same country that blockades us in an effort to asphyxiate our economy. Today, we witness ongoing wars, underdevelopment, poverty, famine, poor systems of communications, and lack of hospitals and schools. The COVID-19 is spreading dramatically, and the African nations are also threatened to lose a significant number of its population. Can the world look away from this situation? Isn't man capable of addressing this situation with the scientific advances? This new virus is attacking everyone. It doesn't discriminate rich from poor, women from men, and children from the elderly. Unity and cooperation are more important than ever before. This is not a matter of ideologies, races, colors, of social classes. It's a matter of life or death for all of us. Currently, 26 Cuban brigades from the Henry Reed Brigade, made up of more than 23,000 specialists, are carrying out our support missions in 24 countries in the fight against COVID-19, from Angola to Italy. Cuba will continue to be generous, fraternal, and humane, under the principle instilled in us by our Commander-in-Chief that solidarity is nothing more than the payment of our debt to humanity, something that is ratified by Cuba day by day to the shame of those who attacked us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernando. I just want to let the audience know that Fernando, if you don't know, is one of the Cuban Five. And he served more than 12 years in US prisons along with his comrades, probably for a total of 75 years in US prisons, simply for defending the Cuban Revolution. One of the things that kept him and the other comrades who were safe in US prisons is when other inmates heard that Fernando and others had served in Angola. It earned deep, deep pride and respect on the part of the inmates there, on their part, to be inmates with the Cuban Five. And so it's of enormous importance that we were able to have Fernando send a message. And the reason why he had to send a message, because I understand the US government does not allow Zoom to go into Cuba. In other words, to have a live performance on TV. So we had to get a video copy that was recorded by Fernando. And so we're very, very appreciative of that fact. And I want to now turn our attention and welcome as a speaker, Brother Mwalimu Keita. I think Mwalimu is back with us. And if so, I'd like to reintroduce him. And Mwalimu is an organizer of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. The All African People's Revolutionary Party is a longtime supporter and defender of the Cuban Revolution here in the United States. Mwalimu?
Yes, and we thank everyone for allowing us to be here. The All African People's Revolutionary Party is a small, uncompromising, and dedicated group of organizers fighting to grow and continue to develop as we refuse to discontinue our life's conscious commitment to remain true to our revolutionary principles, work, and mindful inheritance and continuation of the theory and practice as we understand it of Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, Ahmed Sekou Touré, and Kwame Touré, and other Pan-Africanists towards the realization of Pan-Africanism, one unified social Africa. We express our appreciation and gratitude to the organizing committee effort to illuminate some institutions, the struggles of people in Africa and the Caribbean. Paying humanity's debt.
You're cutting out
Cuba,
a little bit.
Africa. All right, can I be heard? I'm having some technical difficulties.
It's a little
Be
bit.
heard?
Yeah, it's a little bit choppy. Yeah.
All right, I apologize.
Not a problem. This is, we all rolling with the punches when it comes to being virtual. So, we got to just roll with it.
All right. It's important to highlight that Malcolm X is an assassinated Pan-Africanist who loved Fidel and was a staunch supporter and defender of the Cuban Revolution. We also pay homage to our comrade, whose birthday is also today, to Uncle Home, His Excellency Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam. Without hesitation, our own research, knowledge, revolutionary work, and incongruous understanding of history obliges us to acknowledge that with the victory of the Cuban Revolution, January 1st, 1959, revolutionary Cuba has built a socialist country in its proclaimed and active international unity, solidarity, and support with African people in Africa, which is inclusive of as Cuba's internationalism has included those who, through the channels of slavery, came to reside in the Caribbean and in South, Central, and North America. We humbly suggest revolutionary Cuba's personality and internationalism practice has made irrefutable contributions to the revolutionary struggle for Pan-Africanism in Africa. With military or material assistance and historical force in medicine against viruses and other illnesses, including but not limited to Ebola and COVID-19. And for that, the African masses worldwide are forever grateful. This is why we must intensify the international and Pan-African political battle to dismantle immoral and genocidal blockade so socialist Cuba and her beautiful people is able to blossom at its fullest potential for the benefit of our sisters, brothers, and comrades, and in doing so allow Cuba to express its internationalism, its contribution to world humanity unfettered. This also includes the removal of the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which is an infringement on the dignity and sovereignty of the Cuban people. This indignity is also true for the imposition of U.S. AFRICOM and NATO bases in Africa and U.S. SOUTHCOM in the Caribbean, South, and Central America. We are in solidarity, support, and unity with Nicaragua, Venezuela, and also Zimbabwe, all victims of illegal and immoral sanctions by the U.S. In the interest of world peace, we are in harmony with the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, declaring the Caribbean a basin zone of peace. The AAPRP-GC wants for Cuba what Cuba wants for herself, as we are clear that revolutionary Cuba wants what is good, what is right, and what is just for her people. In that spirit, we take this opportunity to inform you that we will further this discussion and others at our annual African Liberation Day, Palestine Nakba Day commemoration, Saturday, May 23rd, under the banner, Not Yet Uhuru, Not Yet Freedom, Not Yet Liberation. African Liberation Day, Palestine Nakba Day is part and parcel of the struggle for Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist efforts to build relationships with revolutionary and progressive African and international peoples, organizations, and movements worldwide, to politically educate and organize the masses of African people, and to educate and develop unity with other peoples for the African Revolution. You can go to our website at a-aaprp-gc.org for more information. We express our gratitude for being a part of this effort and to allow us to express our appreciation and gratitude to revolutionary Cuba and to the world for Cuba's unwavering principled support and unity with the struggles of African people, those in Africa and those abroad. And we thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Mwalimu Keita. As I said, there are many organizations who wanted to express their gratitude and thanks to the people of Cuba and the Cuban Revolution. Another organization that has long ties to the Cuban Revolution is the South African Communist Party. And it was in Cuba that the South African Communist Party was able to hold some of its meetings before it was unbanned in 1990 and 1991. And so on behalf of the South African Communist Party, I'd like to welcome the second Deputy General Secretary, Chris Che Matako. And Chris, welcome to tonight's webinar.
Thank you very much for having me. And also just greetings to the panelists and everybody that's tuned in to be part of this auspicious occasion. Just on a lighter note, it's almost 5 minutes after 3 in the morning in Johannesburg, South Africa. So I'm going to be a bit sleepy, so bear with me in that regard. Well, again, I mean, I think the ambassadors and many other people have laid the basis for us understanding the relationship between Cuba and Africa, but also given very important data in that regard. What we thought we could do is just to flag a few things. And we think these things are important in order to advance the relationship that exists between Cuba, revolutionary Cuba, and the African peoples. First, we want to argue that Cuba is an exemplar of struggle against colonialism and neo-colonialism. So when Africa was decolonizing in the late 50s and etc., there remained one important aspect in the neoconservatives and others in the Western world, which was an important basis that they wanted to keep as an anchor to continue the unfair exploitative relationships with the continent. And we know in the immediate aftermath of the time of the Cuban Revolution in '59, Cuba actually went out to try and assist nations such as Algeria, Guinea-Bissau, and others. What is important for us in this regard is to properly understand both the relationship between Malcolm X's praxis of race and self-defense. And the reason why we're saying this is that those of us who come from Southern Africa, in particular, Namibia, Zimbabwe, also have a clear understanding of racism in those countries, that we can identify with racism and the using of race as an impediment for people's development itself. The important aspect that I think we wanted to flag is the significance of Quito Carnival. And speakers before me have related the cardinal points in Quito Carnival. The fact that Cuba sent almost 300,000 personnel to preserve, in the first instance, the Angolan independence was an important aspect, an important revolutionary act in itself. And that South Africa entered, apartheid South Africa entered the fray on the side of those who sought to undermine Angola's independence, such as Jonas Savimbi and Roberto Holden, created a militarized situation in Southern Africa. And this militarized situation in Southern Africa impacted on countries such as Zimbabwe, former Southwest Africa, Namibia now, including Mozambique, and neighboring Zimbabwe, as I said. The warfare and militarism era of the dying apartheid state came to the fore in the sense that apartheid South Africa's military made incursions deep into the territories of Angola. And so when it was defeated at Cuba Valley, what it did was it provided at least the peoples of Southern Africa the possibility to begin to recoup their lives and also recover from the ravages of war. It is also written in many historic books that apartheid South Africa's relationship with proxies that were supported by the West, and in particular the United States, constructive engagement phenomenon created battles in Mozambique, where Renamo was formed together with elements of the former Portuguese security forces there. They created in former Rhodesia, Zimbabwe now, also mercenary groups whose tactic was death and destruction and the killing of many women and children. And the ambassador from Namibia also talked about Kasinga. In Kasinga, the victims of Kasinga, which we observed a couple of weeks ago, its anniversary, were women and children who could not have been part of a war or would have engaged in a war. But because South Africa, with the support of the United States, within this framework of constructive engagement, understood and saw itself as the military power in Southern Africa. And the yoke of the military power was broken in Cuba Valley. That for us, we think is an important issue that we want to put across. Also, in the recent period with the establishment of the AFRICOM, it has also come to light that those who had served the apartheid regime as consultants and advisors in the war in Cuba Valley are now playing an important part as consultants and other important military advisors in the AFRICOM setup. For us, the lessons of Cuba and the attaining of a just and equitable society is very important. And as we mentioned at the top of this input, is that race for us in South Africa is very important. And the Cuban society, which is also a non-racial society, became an important expression of what a post-apartheid South Africa could be. And it is in that context that in a post-1991 period, with the release of Nelson Mandela and the unbanning of political parties, Mandela, who in his early life, before at a point at the port where the liberation movements were banned, actually studied the Moncada example of Fidel and internal insurrectionary warfare. And he was unfortunately captured in '61, sentenced to 27 years in prison. And when he went out of prison, his first international engagement as the state president of the country was to visit Cuba after he had invited Fidel Castro to his inauguration, and thereupon establish state relations between Cuba and South Africa. Today, in South Africa, we have almost 5,000 to 6,000 young South Africans who would ordinarily not have graduated with a medical degree, who have studied in Cuba. And these are young people who come from rural backgrounds who would not have had the money to enter medical school, but today they graduated as a result of Cuba's assistance, which has made an important contribution towards the process of development and the provision of health care for ordinary South Africans. Furthermore, we think it's important to exalt the fact that even though Cuba had not established an anti-apartheid committee like many other European countries, etc., Cuba's material support, both during the period of struggle and especially during the war in Angola and post-1994, has been very significant. By 1961, Cuba had already received the first batch of those who had went to exile when the African National Congress was banned in 1960. It received close to 60 young exiles who had left, and one of them, Professor Kochiyama, went on to become a very renowned poet, and later on studied in the United States as well. And many other people received military training and other training in that period. So in a nutshell, Cuba contributed both in the pre-1994 period, before the democratization of South Africa, building up the capacities for a post-apartheid South Africa, and also in the post-1994 period when the relationship between Cuba and South Africa was solidified and codified into state relations. And Cuba continues even today. Just in the last 2 days or so, almost 780 Cuban medical professionals came to South Africa to assist in the battle of COVID-19. Most of them have been distributed to the 9 provinces to go and assist the authorities in that regard. So Cuba for us is not only a matter of studying and doing theoretical research about it. In fact, we have engaged and continue to feel Cuba's benevolence in many ways that we interact. And therefore, as the Friends of Cuba Society, we have organized and continue to organize both inside the democratic state in South Africa, but also the broad progressive movement and the broad progressive community in our country to rally behind Cuba, to rally behind the assistance that it gives to many other African countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Again, Chris is the second Deputy General Secretary of the South African Communist Party. Should also be mentioned that in South Africa, there's a monument to the heroes and the martyrs who died in struggle in the liberation of Southern Africa. And in that monument is a special tribute to the 2,000 Cubans who lost their lives in the struggle for Southern African liberation. And with that said, I'd like to turn it back over to Co-Chair Kennedy.
Again, that was amazing, Shay. Thank you so much. So our next panelist is Isaac Saini. He's a co-chair of Canadian Network on Cuba, a professor at Dalhousie University, and the author of the forthcoming book, Africa's Children Return, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End. I am happy to present Isaac Saini.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and that I'm going to be building on some of the stuff that Comrade Chris has said, and basically Cuba's role in Southern Africa's liberation struggle. Since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution on January 1st, 1959, Cuba is engaged in ongoing solidarity with the peoples and the continent of Africa. Cuba Solidarity Africa is not simply one country coming to the aid of other countries, but a part of the African diaspora, the Black world rising to the defense of Africa. in tribute to Cuba's assistance to African liberation struggles, Amilcar Cabral, the celebrated leader of the anti-colonial national liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, stated, and you see the quote here, "I don't believe in life after death, but if there is, we can be sure that the souls of our forefathers who were taken away to America to be slaves are rejoicing today to see their children reunited and working together to help us be independent and free." On July 26, 1991, Nelson Mandela said, and this is a very famous quote, "The Cuban people hold a special place in the hearts of the people of Africa. The Cuban internationalists have made a contribution to African independence, freedom, and justice unparalleled for its principled and selfless character. Cubans came to our region as doctors, teachers, soldiers, agricultural experts, but never as colonizers. They have shared the same trenches with us in the struggle against colonialism, underdevelopment, and apartheid. Cuba's critical contribution to the struggle against the racist, fascist apartheid state in South Africa is not only frequently ignored in Western media, but is often treated as almost as if it had never occurred. However, the overarching significance of Cuba's role cannot be erased. This has been mentioned by the ambassador, it's been mentioned by Comrade Chris. Under Operation Carlota, Cuba not only defended Angola's independence from South African aggression, but played a decisive role in South African national and anti-colonial liberation struggles. Operation Carlota, named after a revolt against slavery that took place in Cuba on November 15, 1843, lasted more than 15 years. During that time, more than 330,000 Cubans served in Angola. More than 2,000, as August pointed out, died defending Angolan independence and the freedom and fight of self-determination of the peoples of Southern Africa. In October 1975, South Africa, with the complicity of Washington, invaded Angola. Havana initiated Operation Carlota on November 5th, 1975, in response to a direct and urgent request from the government of Angola, which had just achieved independence after a long and brutal anti-colonial struggle against Portugal. Angola confronted invasion by this racist South African forces, which was determined to destroy an independent Black government. Operation Carlota was decisive, not only in pushing back, not only in saving Luanda, the capital of Angola, from capture, but also pushing the South Africans out of Angola. The defeat of South African forces was a major development in the South African anti-colonial and national liberation struggle. Havana's decision to deploy combat troops thwarted apartheid South Africa's goal of converting Angola into a neo-colony. At the time, The World, a Black South African newspaper, in fact, the second largest newspaper in South Africa at that time, underscored the significance, and I quote, "Black Africa is riding the crest of a wave generated by Cuban success in Angola. Black Africa is tasting the heady wine of the possibility of realizing the total dream of liberation." The Cuban leadership justified its military support in Southern Africa as both defending an independent country from foreign invasion, but also as repaying a historical debt owed by Cuba to Africa, humanity's debt. Fidel Castro frequently invoked Cuba's historical links to Africa. On the 15th anniversary of the Cuban victory at Playa Heron, known in the United States as the Bay of Pigs, he famously declared, quote, that those who once enslaved man and sent him to America perhaps never imagined that one of those peoples who received slaves would one day send their fighters to struggle for freedom in Africa. "We are a Latin African people," he declared. This sentiment did not solely belong to Fidel Castro. It prevailed within the revolutionary leadership. Jorge Risquet, Havana's principal diplomat in Africa from the 1970s to the 1990s, was also unambiguous in explaining Cuba's military intervention in terms of Cuba's historic and moral obligations as a consequence of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery as a whole. Most significantly, Raul Castro was an avid supporter and shaper of this policy. In a 1976 report to the Cuban Communist Party's Politburo on a 2-month visit to Angola, the Republic of Congo, and Guinea, he emphasized that coming to the aid of Africa's national liberations was, quote, an internationalist duty. In other official documents and meetings, he consistently articulated the necessity to, quote, continue to help Africa in the anti-imperial struggle. For example, in a 1985 meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev, he declared, "Africa is literally dying while the United States exploits it." Cuba's obligations to Africa and its linkage resonated with the citizens of the island nation, especially with Black Cubans, who were able to make a symbolic connection with their African roots. For many, fighting in Angola was akin to defending Cuba, except that the fight was this time in Africa, as one fighter said. And they were aware that Africa was in some sense their homeland. Reverend Abundo Gonzalez underscored this connection. Quote, My grandfather came from Angola, so it is my duty to go and help Angola. I owe it to my ancestors. General Raphael Morrison echoed this sentiment and the words of Amilcar Cabral, and this is what he said. When we arrived in Angola, I heard an Angolan say that our grandparents, whose children were taken from Africa to be slaves, would be happy to see their grandchildren return to Africa to help trade. I will always remember those words. Cuban involvement in Southern Africa has repeatedly been dismissed as surrogate activity for the Soviet Union. This insidious myth has been unequivocally refuted. John Stockwell, the director of CIA operations in Angola, during and in the immediate aftermath of the 1975 South African invasion, in his memoir, In Search of Enemies, a CIA story, stated, quote, "We learned that Cuba had not been ordered into action by the Soviet Union. To the contrary, the Cuban leaders felt compelled to intervene for their own ideological reasons." In his much acclaimed book, Conflicting Missions, Havana, Washington, Africa, 1959 to 1979, Perugla Hayes demonstrated that the Cuban government, as it had repeatedly asserted, decided to dispatch combat troops to Angola only after the Angolan government had requested Cuba's military assistance to repel the South Africans, refuting Washington's assertion that South African forces intervened in Angola only after the arrival of the Cuban forces. And the Soviet Union had no role in Cuba's decision and were not even informed prior to the deployment. In short, Cuba was not the puppet of the Soviet Union. Even The Economist magazine, not a bastion of progressive politics, neither socialist ideas, in a 2002 article acknowledged that the Cuban government had acted on its own initiative. That Cuba could act on its own initiative independent of the will of the great powers was not only an anathema to Washington, but inconceivable in their racist hierarchical understanding of the world. In 1969, Henry Kissinger, then National Security Advisor, who then became US Secretary of State under Nixon, unambiguously and uncategorically declared, quote, "Nothing important can come from the South. History has never been produced in the South. The axis of history starts in Moscow, goes to Bonn, crosses to Washington, and then goes to Tokyo." So I guess, as a side comment, the Japanese were made honorary Europeans. What happens in the South is of no importance, he said. That Cuba, a poor, quote unquote, third world country, a Latin African nation, could act on its own, and through that independent action, shape history, enraged Kissinger. At Kissinger's behest, a number of extensive military plans were drawn up by the Pentagon in 1975 and 1976 to specifically punish the island for daring to defy the imperial order with its racist global hierarchy. These detailed plans encompassed naval blockade to aerial bombardment to outright invasion. While they were never carried out, these options were seriously discussed and debated within the highest levels of the US government, poignantly illustrating the dangers that Cuba faced and accepted during its international defense of Angola. As was pointed out by the ambassador to Namibia and by Comrade Chris, there was a war waged by South Africa, the racist South African regimes in all of that particular region of Africa. From 1975 to 1988, the South African armed forces embarked on a campaign of massive destabilization of the region. The war of destabilization wrought a terrible toll. Between 1981 and 1988, an estimated 1.5 million people were directly or indirectly killed, including 825,000 children. This was the result of Pretoria-sponsored terrorist insurgencies, UNITA in Angola and Renamo in Mozambique, and direct military actions by the South African armed forces. We've heard mention of Kasinga. Unfortunately, I can't get my PowerPoint to work, but I have the photo of the May 4th, one of the mass graves of the May 4th, 1978 massacre. South Africa launched numerous bombing raids, armed incursions, and assassinations against surrounding countries. As was pointed out by Comrade Chris and by the ambassador, the decisive military confrontation with South Africa occurred around the southeastern town of Cuito-Cuanavale. Cuito-Cuanavale was a critical turning point in the struggle against apartheid. From November 1987 to March 1988, the South African forces repeatedly tried and failed to capture Cuito-Cuanavale. The Cuban commitment was immense, providing the essential reinforcements, material, and planning. Fidel Castro stated that the Cuban Revolution had put, quote, its own existence at stake because it risked a huge battle against one of the strongest powers located in the third world, against one of the richest powers with significant industrial and technological development, armed to the teeth at such great distance from our small country and with our own resources, our own arms. We used our own ships on ours alone. We used our own equipment to change relationship forces, which made success possible in the battle. We put everything at stake in that action, end of quote. The military effort culminated in the decisive defeat of the South African armed forces at the Battle of Cuba. The defeat of the South African armed forces at Cuba drove the apartheid army out of Angola and altered the balance of power in Southern Africa. South Africa was forced to the negotiating table, which directly resulted in Namibian independence and accelerated the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. While circumstances may have changed, Cuba solidarity with Africa continues. Cuba made a critical contribution to the fight against the Ebola epidemic in the West African nations of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. The Cuban medical mission was by far the largest sent by any country. Standing side by side with the peoples of West Africa, Cuban doctors and nurses went to West Africa and joined the struggle against Ebola. As Jorge Lebrun Nicolas, Cuba's ambassador to Liberia, declared, quote, "We cannot see our brothers from Africa in difficult times remain and have our arms folded." At the September 6, 2014 meeting of the United Nations Security Council to discuss the Ebola epidemic, Cuban Representative Abelardo Moreno declared, "Humanity has a debt to African people. We cannot let them down." Even the Wall Street Journal at the time declared, "Few have heeded the call, but one country has responded in strength, Cuba." And we now see with the Cuban medical brigades being sent to Africa to combat COVID-19, this commitment to African humanity. In closing, Cuba has often been described as the only foreign country to have gone to Africa and gone away with nothing but the coffins of its sons and daughters who died in the struggles to liberate Africa. Perhaps this best sums up Cuba and Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next, I'm going to pass it over to our co-chair, August, to introduce our next video that we will be presenting to you all.
Yes. Thanks very much, Kennedy and Isaac. As always, we learned a lot. Really appreciate it. One of the countries in the Caribbean where the Cuban Revolution had a major impact. It was the small island of Grenada, of 100,000 people. And so what we will look at now is a short video, given by the president of the Grenadian Revolution, Maurice Bishop, in Brooklyn in 1983, a few months before the US invasion, preceded by the coup d'etat that overthrew the Grenadian Revolution and the US invasion in March of 1983. And so without further ado, we will now look at this video.
On June 5th, 1983, Grenada's Prime Minister, Maurice Bishop, addressed an audience of some 3,000 people at Hunter College in New York City. Bishop was in the United States as part of his government's long-standing policy to normalize relations with the United States. But the Reagan administration, rather than consenting to meet with the Prime Minister, stepped up its attacks against Grenada, accusing the Bishop government of being a Soviet-Cuban pawn and a threat to democracy in the region.
The real reason for all of this hostility is because some perceive that what is happening in Grenada can lay the basis for a new socio-economic and political path of development. They give all kinds of reasons and excuses, some of them credible, some utter rubbish. There's an interesting one that we saw very recently in a secret report of the State Department. I want to tell you about that one, so you can reflect on that one. That secret report made this point, that Grenada is different to Cuba and Nicaragua, and the Grenada Revolution is in one sense even worse, I'm using their language, than the Cuban and Nicaraguan revolutions, because the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada speaks English and therefore can communicate directly to the people of the United States. that same report also said, that also made us very dangerous. And that is that the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada are predominantly black. They said that 95% of our population is black, and they had a correct statistic. And if we have 95% of predominantly African origin in our country, then we can have a dangerous appeal to 30 million black people in the United States.
Less than 5 months after his appearance at Hunter College, Maurice Bishop, a number of leading members of the New Jewel movement, and many Grenadan citizens were killed. 6 days later, following the executions and killings, 6,000 U.S. troops, supported by helicopter gunships, fighter aircraft, and a large
Thanks very much. Well, that video was very moving for me. I confusingly said that the invasion took place in March, but actually it was in October. I was there in March of 1983, and I had a chance to witness exactly the kinds of things that Maurice Bishop was talking about on the island, and indeed the potential impact this small island of 100,000 people would have on English-speaking people of African origin within the United States. I'd like to now turn to someone who I had the honor to meet many years ago, who was the press secretary for the martyred Prime Minister of Grenada, Maurice Bishop, Don Rojas. He was the press secretary to the Prime Minister Bishop from 1981 until 1983. And today he is the executive political editor of the Real News Network, director.
Actually, August Don is, unfortunately, he's having some technical issues with the blackout going on in DC. So he may be on a little bit later. So we are going to go on to the next panelist that we have, which is Franz.
Thanks.
Voltaire. If you want to introduce him, you're more than welcome to. Or
Please, I'll pass on to you, Kennedy.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. So we have our next, happy to introduce our next panelist of Franz Voltaire. Is a Haitian scholar and activist living in Montreal, Quebec. He is an author of Black Power in Haiti and a Brief History of Blacks in Canada. He is also the founder and chairperson of, and forgive me, I do not speak French or Creole, so chairperson of Le Centre International de Documentation, it's Information, Haiti, Caribbean, and Afro-Canadian. And CIDICHCA is the abbreviation for this organization. And you now have the floor. You are muted right now. You're muted. Oh, Franz, you're muted, so we cannot hear you. Thanks. If you could just click your unmute button. There you go.
Okay. You heard me? Okay.
Yes.
I want to congratulate the people who invite me to this panel. I want to say, as a Haitian, Haitian history is intertwined with Cuban history. I remember that on this date, Marti left Haiti to meet his fate in Cuba. But I want to say Haiti is in great debt with Cuba. First of all, in 1959, the Cuban Revolution take a decision, very important decision. Haitians, was the Haitian migrants, thousands of them, they give them Cuban citizenship. And it's very important because it was the only country until now who give people they said they were illegal when the leadership said, you can't be illegal in one country. And they give the Haitian the possibility to find themselves as Cuban citizen. Today, it's a very important minority. From Camagüey to Baracoa, there is an important Haitian community in Cuba, maybe thousands of them. Some of them fight also in Angola. And I think to remember one of them who died in Haiti, Dr. Sansarik. He was in Cuba with, in Congo, not in Angola, but it was in Congo with the Che. He was a doctor. He works in Sierra Maestra. And he fought in Haiti, where he died in 1969 against the Duvalier regime. In 2000, Cuba sent a medical brigade in Haiti to help the poor Haitian people who didn't have access to doctors. And the brigade and the Cuban medical brigade are still in Haiti. They were very helpful during the earthquake, the hurricanes, and the fight against the cholera. I have to remember that 900 people were infected with international troops who occupy Haiti since 1994. And they bring cholera in Haiti. And the Cuban brigade was very important in this fight. And today, when we find the COVID-19, Cubans send also some doctors, nurses to fight against that. Now, Haitian Revolution was at the beginning, and the Cuban leadership used to say that there was a link, historical link between this first revolution who abolished slavery, the Haitian Revolution. And by the way, yesterday, May 18 was the date where the Haitian begins their fight for their independence. And so Haiti has to suffer an embargo. US recognized Haiti in 1860 in 1865 after the Civil War. France made Haiti paid a huge sum. We are talking about billions of dollars of today, that Haiti can be recognized as a sovereign nation. In 1915, Haiti was occupied by US troops for 19 years. In 1994, Haiti again was occupied. And so when we talk about embargo, we know what that means for Haitian people, because they can't accept that Black people can be free. There was these books about where Blacks rules rights, our Black cousins, cannibals, all these stereotypes on Haiti made that Haiti has to, people forgot that Bolivar organized his own expedition from Haiti. And if I want to conclude, I can say the historical meetings between José Marti and our great thinker who the first published The Equality of the Human Race, Antenor Firmin. And we are actually in our center translating in French the work of José Marti. It was very important for us, and Marti and Maceo also. Maceo, the great Afro-Cuban fighter for the independence of Cuba, visited Haiti, and it was important and symbolic that Haitians have a very strong link with Cuba. And we think that in this time of coronavirus, in these times where we as human people, we think that we need cooperation and not confrontation, because we are living in a world where what is at stake with the climate change? It's the survival of the human species. Thank you very much. And I think humanity has a great debt with Cuba.
Thank you so much, Franz. And also with that, Toussaint Louverture's birthday, 227th birthday is tomorrow. So we want to honor that as well, and all solidarity with Haiti. So it looks like I'm passing this over to my co-chair, August, to introduce our next panelist.
Thanks very much. France Voltaire, I want to thank you again, especially that history about the relations between Cuba and Haiti. Fidel Castro said when he was in prison, one of the big influences on him was to read about Toussaint Louverture. Had a big impact on him. Also in his youth, the discrimination that Haitians faced within Cuba also had a big impact on him in teaching him about racism within Cuba. And lastly, one of the lessons of the Haitian Revolution for the Cubans was the necessity of solidarity. If you make a revolution, international solidarity. And that was one of the things missing, unfortunately, in the Haitian Revolution. So what we're doing here in bringing solidarity to the Cuban Revolution is crucially important, especially when we put it in comparison to what the Haitian Revolution was unable to receive. I have the honor of introducing our last speaker. And after our last speaker, we will have a few comments, the co-chairs, and then we will open it up to a question and answer period. I'd like to introduce Obe Egbuna. Obe is with the Stay Out of Cuba Way campaign, which he will say something about. It's an important solidarity campaign going on now, initiated recently here in the United States. And he's also with the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. And he is the author of Cuba's Greatest Army, a tribute to the Cuban doctors. It's a children's play. And so I have the honor of welcoming Obe Egbuna. Obe, I hope you're there.
Everyone hear me?
Yes, can you speak up a little bit?
Yes, I definitely can. Can everybody hear me now? Can everyone hear me?
A little low, if you can do a little bit louder, that'd be great.
Okay, let me see if I can. How about now?
Better.
Okay, good. All right, thank you. I'm honored on behalf of the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. I'm honored to be here tonight with you all this evening. I have the challenge of going after so many dynamic presenters and genuine workers in relationship to this issue. I thank the panelists and the organizers for their labor. And so I'll start. I am the External Relations Officer to the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. I was recruited into that organization 14 years ago by Ambassador Cosme Torres Espinosa, then the Cuban ambassador to Zimbabwe, who has the distinction of being the highest ranking diplomat, Cuban diplomat, to be deported from Washington in 2003, when Cuba still had an intersection under false charges of espionage. So I felt that it was of paramount importance to talk about that. And his next detail, of course, is Zimbabwe. The relationship between Cuba and Zimbabwe, the highlight of it is between 1986 and 1996, 3,000 Zimbabwean teachers were trained in Cuba. And that is the reason why Zimbabwe today boasts a 97% literacy rate, which is the highest on the African continent. So I thought it was important to begin there. Of course, we're here to pay homage to Omawale, Brother Malcolm. So because it was the FBI, CIA, and the New York Police Department who were responsible for his assassination and not the Nation of Islam. I have to say that in around 2004, I was under FBI investigation for frequenting the Cuban intersection at the time, now the Cuban embassy. So in the spirit of Brother Malcolm, I have to say, if the FBI decided to take my life, I couldn't think of a better reason than to leave this planet standing firm with the Cuban people and Cuban Revolution. We say that since we're honoring Ho Chi Minh today as well, we know that one of Ho Chi Minh's most compelling quotes is, when the prison doors open, the real dragons fly out. So to Comrade Fernando Gonzalez, then of the Cuban Five and now the head of ECAP, his life, his service, his selflessness, his solidarity is a testament to that quote from Ho Chi Minh. He is a dragon and he breathes the fire that best represents the authenticity of the Cuban people and the Cuban Revolution. Jose Marti once said that barricades of ideas are greater than barricades of stone. But with that being said, it doesn't hurt when the people with the stones have ideas and they get the stones to carry out those ideas when they're oppressed, when they're exploited, when they're being dehumanized. And because of that, we say that when the Palestinians take on Zionist Israeli tanks with stones, it's a courageous thing. When the Zimbabwean liberation struggle started, the armed struggle in 1966, the first attack on British Rhodesian forces were by 4 young people called the Crocodile Group, and it was with stones. So there are times when stones can make the difference because it represents the authentic will of the people. When we come to talk about Cuba, Africa, and the Caribbean paying humanity's debt, they do it by continuing to embrace the fighting spirit that has always helped them persevere on the battlefield against the forces who are the biggest threat to its natural course. For Africans at home and abroad, it is that secret weapon that Ho Chi Minh called nationalism that held us together as we overcame the barriers of captivity and settler colonialism. This is why we have arrived at the conclusion that Cuba and not US imperialism best personifies the term homeland security. For Africans at home and abroad, we also say we are thankful to that nationalist and patriotic expression displayed by Cuba and revolutionary forces in Africa and the Caribbean, and it is because of the conviction to that the images of Hitler, the images of Mussolini, the image of Zionist Israel, and the Ku Klux Klan are not the ones that come to mind when people mention nationalism. All equivalent to when people think of religion, when Marx called it the opiate of the masses, talking about European cultural dynamics. We know in the African context, whether we're talking about John Chilimbwe taking up arms in Malawi as a good Christian, Nat Turner taking up arms as a good Christian, Harriet Tubman being called Moses, a liberator of her people, we know that religion and spirituality ignites us and wakes us up every time we encounter challenges. So in that same regard, Cuba and Africa and the Caribbean have purified nationalism. This is very important because at one point in history, the Soviet Union, based on its paternalist disposition, felt the need to call certain movements in Africa authentic to suggest that others were not. But it is Cuba, because of the fact that they have always been objective with Africa, they did not just embrace the liberation movements in Africa that had the Soviet Union's blessing. It was Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and the Convention People's Party that first acknowledged the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in the world. The only other person that Comandante Fidel Castro called an apostle other than Jose Marti was none other than Ahmed Sékou Touré, leader of the Democratic Party of Guinea, being the first country in Africa that Comandante Fidel visited. Ben Bella and Algeria, Kennedy attempted to bribe Ben Bella here, telling him if he bypassed his trip to Cuba, the United States would do anything for Algeria. Of course, Ben Bella defied him. And when we talk about recipients of the Jose Marti Award, before Mandela in 1990, the first one is Thomas Sankara out of Burkina Faso in '85. The second one is the late Pan-African icon, Robert Gabriel Mugabe. So it is very important, and as a matter of fact, since we're focusing on Southern Africa tonight, we must remember that 3 years after the assassination of Maurice Bishop, October 19th, 1986, when Comrade Samora Machel was assassinated through a plane crash, 2 Cuban doctors died with him, and those Cuban doctors are considered national heroes in Mozambique today. It is the never-ending commitment to revolutionary Pan-Africanism and the solidarity with the Cuban people. We recognize that we have an obligation. So when we talked about the decolonization process in Africa, and we talked about party building, where in 1946, Ahmed Sekou Touré and the Guinean people start the Democratic Party of Guinea. In 1949, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah and the Ghanaian people start the Convention People's Party. In the 1950s, you have UNIP in Zambia, and of course the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau. You also have to include in 1908 in Cuba, Partido Independiente de Cola, the first all-African political party in the Western Hemisphere. 1 year before the NAACP, 1 year before Du Bois writes the book about John Brown, 1 year before Katherine Dunham is born. We say that being a socialist nation that continues to overcome a monstrous and crippling blockade inspires all of us, as we congratulate the people of Eritrea as they were able to get their sanctions lifted. We say that as Zimbabwe is in their 19th year of sanctions because they reclaimed 70% of their country's most agriculturally resourceful land. 350,000 families have land in their clutches, which 4,500 commercial farmers of European, Rhodesian, and British ancestry once had. We see the sanctions against Venezuela. We see the sanctions against Nicaragua. We saw the regime change efforts in Bolivia. And this is coming at a time Cuba's staying true to the course of socialism, at a time where you take a look at the 25 poorest nations on earth, 22 of them are African. Of the 784 million people on the planet that are considered extremely poor, 400 million of them are in Africa, living on $1.90 a day. We say that it is incumbent, and defending Cuba's solidarity is also on a personal level. We look at it this way. Lumumba was assassinated 8 years before I was born. Mandela was overthrown 4 years before I was born. Nkrumah was overthrown 3 years before I was born. Modibo Keita was overthrown 1 year before I was born. I was 4 years old when Amilcar Cabral was assassinated, and 14 years old when Maurice Bishop was assassinated. This is why defending Cuba's territorial integrity is of paramount importance and will continue to be. Cuba's practical approach to revolutionary solidarity is very important at a time in history where we are experiencing the bastardization of methodology. Many want to hide behind the purity of their ideas because they have lost the will to execute those ideas. Never the case in Cuba. We say that Cuba's solidarity between Africa represents a solidarity that cannot be contaminated, it cannot be sabotaged by cross-generational tensions, closet racism, dogmatic entities who don't appreciate growth and expansion. It is solidarity rooted in resistance for change and will never be undermined by resistance to change. On a practical level, in conclusion, we say that tonight is excellent for us because for the last month, we have a campaign called the Get Out Cuba Way campaign, not the Stay Out of Cuba's Way campaign, Get Out Cuba Way. And it has 4 areas of concentration. Number 1, for the Henry Reeves Brigade to come here and treat the people affected by the COVID pandemic. Number 2, provide medical training to those those medical personnel who are obviously overwhelmed because they're not used to functioning in the midst of a pandemic. Number 3, they would work in conjunction with the National Medical Association, which has represented Africans in U.S. borders since 1896, the Black Nurses Association, and the American Medical Association. The 4th thing is we are calling for the clinical trial of alpha 2B, interferon 2B. And we thank Cuba for creating that, because when Africans think of vaccinations initiated by the imperialists, we think of the Tuskegee experiment. We think of our Native American sisters and brothers being subjected to smallpox because Amherst injected smallpox in their blankets. Cuba is the complete diametrical opposite of that. So when imperialism accuses Cuba of politicizing health, we say don't mistake them for Doctors Without Borders or the United States Agency for International Development. When you look at our appeal, you can go to hashtag Get Out of Cuba's Way, hashtag Cuban Blockade Inhumane. We also feel that this is a time when we're focusing on Africa. We say Cuba or more Africa, Africa or more Cuba. At a time where many people through the United States Chamber of Commerce, where they used Ghana and Akufo-Addo, the president, to net $2.9 billion last year in tourism. And that is only being done to promote neocolonialism in Africa. The alternative is for us to create a pool, a capital pool, to go ahead and help finance Cuba's medical efforts on the African continent. And of course, through this process, the Henry Reeves Brigade being able to come here, that will lead to more Africans going to the medical school, the Latin American School of Medical Sciences, so we can get more Charles Drews, more Daniel Hale Williams, more Frantz Fanons, more Augustino Nitos, more Samuel Paranatos. We, the Mass Emphasis Children's History and Theater Company, 8 years ago, did that children's play. And from that play was supposed to come a memorandum of understanding between the Mass Emphasis Children's History and Theater Company and La Comunita, Cuba's national children's theater company. That was only our second play. We've done 20 plays in the last 8 years. We are more than ready to have that relationship now. Between 2013 and 2016, in conjunction with Mutulu Olobala, affectionately known as M1 of the internationally acclaimed hip-hop group Dead Prez, we did 3 albums of music, The Battle Cry for Cuba and Zimbabwe, over 100 songs, cross-generational, multi-genre, artists calling for the lifting of the blockade on Cuba and the lifting of sanctions on Zimbabwe. And in conclusion, as we finalize, we're calling for one more thing as a follow-up to the appeal that we just successfully initiated. On July 26th weekend, July 26th falls on a Sunday, we're saying between July 25th and July 26th, we're calling for a global artistic and cultural tribute to Cuba called Africa and the World Thanks Cuba, where artists all over the world can perform, showing their solidarity to the people of Cuba. We end by saying this: one unified socialist Cuba, one unified socialist America, one unified socialist Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Obi. We appreciate it. And your comments are very appropriate because you began to talk about things we need to do now. And so before the question and answer, so before the question and answer period, the co-chairs would like to make a few announcements. And I'll kick it off with a pitch, a donation pitch. And the reason for the donation pitch is that the conference organizers want to do a conference, are planning to do the international conference for the normalization of US-Cuba relations in November, this coming November. This was a conference that was supposed to have been again in March that we were unable to hold. So it will be in November of 2020 this year. It will be in New York City, and we are fundraising to make the conference possible. And the conference will work toward the normalization of US-Cuban relations. We want to bring Cubans to New York and from elsewhere to be a part of that conference, and that's the purpose of the donation pitch that I'm making. And here on the screen, there are details about how to make that donation at our website. And please note carefully, I think we'll keep it up on the screen. And with that, I want to turn it over to Co-Chair Kennedy.
Thank you, August, for that. And yes, if you are able to attend, if you are in New York City or able to have the means to be able to donate, that information is on there as well as on the website. So we do have one last video that's demanding, U.S. hands off of Venezuela and to stop all mercenary attempts of invasion in Venezuela. So we have a video from our Afro-Venezuelan community that we are happy to present to you all.
O uno es ciudadano o no es ciudadano para nada. Si uno es ciudadano, uno es libre. Si uno no es ciudadano, es esclavo. Y el gobierno americano tiene miedo de admitir que nunca dio libertad al hombre negro en América. Y ni siquiera reconoce que en América el hombre negro no es libre, no es ciudadano y carece de sus derechos. Lo esconde hábilmente con esas bonitas palabras de ciudadanía de segunda clase. Eso es colonialismo, neocolonialismo, imperialismo. Esas son las palabras de uno de los hombres del pueblo afroestadounidense más influyente del siglo XX. Y una referencia para todas y todos. Hoy, desde el pueblo valiente y cimarrón de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela, tierra de Bolívar, tierra de José Leonardo Chirinos, de Argelia Laya y de Hugo Chávez, queremos enviar un saludo fraterno, además de solidaridad y acompañamiento irrestricto y combativo al pueblo afro de los Estados Unidos en conmemoración del nacimiento de Malcolm X. Un momento para reflexionar sobre nuestra conciencia histórica, pero además de nuestra conciencia política, un elemento focal en nuestra agenda programática de lucha. Nuestra liberación no es posible en el sistema capitalista, que vio su primera expresión de globalización en el comercio transatlántico, a través del secuestro de africanas y africanos para luego esclavizarlos en la vía Yala, como dicen los indígenas, y que luego los colonialistas bautizaron como América.
And we will also be posting the translation of that in the chat, so you're able to, anyone who is not Spanish speaking will be able to see what our comrade was talking about. With that being said, we also have our Saving Lives campaign that we are a part of in the midst of the coronavirus that my colleague here and co-chair August is happy to present and let you know how you can help out and what's going on as far as COVID-19 in the world right now.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have it up on my screen at the moment. Can we put it up on the screen, the Saving Lives campaign?
If not, I can read off just a little bit of a paragraph of what exactly the campaign is about. So It's regarding Cuba's interferon alpha 2B recombinant, which is gaining an increasing international profile in the fight against COVID-19. Articles have been published in News Weekly, Le Monde Diplomatique, International Business Times, and important scientific journals like L'Cent and the World Journal of Pediatrics. In Cuba and its medical missions in more than 25 countries, IFN-REC is a crucial part of the treatment protocols and is also used as a preventative measure to protect healthcare workers as well. So China and Spain have incorporated IFN-REC into their national protocols and clinical guidelines for COVID-19 treatment, where it is a crucial component of the antiviral treatment to combat the coronavirus. And that is IF as in Frank, N as in Nancy, REC, if you would like to check out more. And there's also some more information on our screen that is there for you all. And I think with that being said, we are on to our Q&A. So there are a few questions that we have. If you do have any questions for any specific panelists, you're more than welcome to click the Q&A button there and type it in, and just let us know if you're wanting to ask somebody specifically or if you just have a general question, and we will put it out on the floor for everyone. So let's see. Give me one moment. All right, yeah, there's a big one there. Okay. So there is a question that was asked earlier that says, there's been great coverage of the Cuban medical brigades departing and landings across the world. What is the best source of documenting the results of their service so that we also share it with the world? So it's asking if there's been any documentation of the Cuba medical brigades going across the world. Maybe this is a question that Ambassador may be able to answer, or any of our panelists.
Isaac here, before, as we're waiting for the ambassador. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'd suggest that people read John Kirk's book, Medical Internationalism, Healthcare Without Borders. He's one of the leading experts outside of Cuba and Cuba's medical internationalism, has had a long relationship with Cuba, has interviewed over 270 doctors, has been with them in Central America on their work, and has been doing a tremendous amount of interviews on this issue as well. He's done over, I think it's close to 20 interviews with different international broadcasting corporate media outlets from Australia all the way through the United States, United Kingdom. He's a leading expert on this and very well respected and trusted in Cuba.
Thank you.
And of course, Grandma. Read everything in Grandma and Juventud Rebelde.
Yes.
No, that's what I'm about to say. There's a lot of information in the Cuban press, but also I recommend, besides the recommendation of Isa, there is also a book of Enrique Vieta that is about the Zona Roja, red zone, that is about the Cuban cooperation in the fight Ebola. It's quite interesting. I recommend to all of you to read it. But also now if you can see, every day or every week there is a Cuban brigade dispatched to different countries, not only to Africa, but the Caribbean and now to Europe. It's the first time that we have South-North cooperation in the area of combating the COVID. So we have a lot of information about the brigade. And also, let me tell you, we are not only sending brigade in those countries that because of the condition, there is no flight, the borders are closed. In those countries that we cannot send brigade now, we are having this kind of video conference with the specialists from those countries in order to share with their doctors our experience, our knowledge, how to treat, what are the protocols that we are following. And this is also helping a lot to those countries that now have also have to fight the COVID-19. So it's the other way to cooperate when we cannot reach those countries with our doctors.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. If you could also just repeat the name of the book, that would be great. The name of the book.
In English, it's published in English, it's Red Zone. Zona Roja, Red Zone.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I hope that our audience got that. 1 moment. All right. Chris, I think I have a question that might be good for you. So this one is, what can we all do to what can we all do to end the U.S. blockade of Cuba all over the world? For instance, an example, every May 19th, the world demonstration or celebration of the African-Caribbean connection. So again, what can we do to end the U.S. blockade of Cuba all over the world?
Well, I think the most potent weapon that we have is what in Cuba they talk about as building people-to-people relations. And that's what we are trying to also try and entrench on the African continent. It's important to do two things, I think. One is to build the solidarity committees with Cuba, with a whole range of people and progressives, and we might not necessarily agree on the ideological and the main, ideological and political issues of the day. But the most important thing that we need to be doing, I think, is to build these committees and make them vehicles through which we can then express people-to-people relations. The second part of it is to do these people exchanges together with Cuba. So the brigades that go to Cuba, Venceremos, and other brigades, the Mayday brigades, they also provide a platform for a community of nations coming together in Cuba and experiencing Cuba and the reality of Cuba as it would come about. Because I think those things have a lasting impact on people's understanding and appreciation of both the reality of Cuba and also building between and amongst them across continents and across oceans, the importance of just sharing their perspectives on Cuba and sharing their experiences of Cuba. In that way, I think would be able to transcend the limitations, which are very important in state relations. But because state relations have got limitations of a whole range of protocols and other things, building people through people relations, I think it's a very important platform of going forward. Thank you.
Can I just add to what Chris said and take advantage of the fact that I forgot to say something when Fernando Gonzalez was speaking. Those of us who do solidarity in other countries have the advantage of working with the Cuban Institute of Friendship with the Peoples, known in Spanish acronym as ECAP. And from the very beginning of the Cuban Revolution understood the importance of fighting for solidarity. And for those of us who do solidarity work around the world, there's no better friend we have than ECAP.
May I speak? This is Andrew. Okay, I'm with the DC Metro Coalition in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. I want to emphasize the need for each of us in our various countries and cities to find ways to physically, publicly protest the U.S. aggression against Cuba and Venezuela. Be they, whether we mount car caravans, whether we mount picket lines or demonstration. I'm all for our practicing social or physical distances, wearing masks, etc., as we do this in the current COVID-19 situation. However, we should hit the streets whenever it's possible, like around July 26th, do the art festival as well as protests, or whatever we wish to do. But the point is that I believe the United States imperialists are vulnerable today because they are under defensive politically, because they are increasingly isolated. I believe more isolated than ever vis-a-vis the hostility to Cuba and Venezuela. So we should up the ante as much as we can and make them pay. And my final point is that with regard to the, as we approach November, and usually Cuba has brought before the United Nations resolution to demand that the blockade be ended. In our various countries and cities, whether we're in New York or, we're not all going to be in New York, we should hit the streets to solidarize with what Cuba is trying to do in the United Nations. Those in New York might want to be at the UN. Those in DC might want to be at the White House or the Federal Building, wherever. But we should hit the street and put more and more pressure on the imperialists.
I wanted to say something.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm gonna reiterate what I said I think being strategically creative and daring to push the envelope and daring to expand. As I concluded, I said that as a follow-up to the appeal that we did, we're calling for July 26th weekend, Africa and the World Thanks Cuba, a cultural and artistic tribute to the Cuban Revolution. We've already had correspondence with artists in Liberia, artists in Zimbabwe, artists in Guyana, artists in Venezuela, and different places that people are gonna, and we're gonna put more information out about this tomorrow. Our theater company, the Mass Emphasis Children's History and Theater Company, we have another component called the Mass Emphasis Positive Action and Creativity Youth Brigade. These children ranging between 16 and 21, they're creating a video which will complement the written appeal that we did last month. That's supposed to be ready by Friday. And like we said, we want to follow up. And the current Cuban ambassador to Botswana, when she was a diplomat in DC, Ambassador Piego, she was the one who initiated that Mass Emphasis should have a children's to children exchange with La Comunita. We are ready. So we think that it's things of that nature that are different, that are creative, because what you have in the United States, you have the assembled Cuban Solidarity Network, IFCO, Venceremos, Hands Off Cuba Coalition, U.S.-Cuba Normalization. But then on the other side, you have a dispersed network that is primarily African, that love you and can't wait to work with you and serve you in a multitude of capacities. We don't get a chance to come down there as much, but trust me and believe me, we're into executing everything that we articulate. So once again, we're going to be pushing very aggressively that cultural and artistic tribute to Cuba, July 26th weekend. We're going to be doing more work with the children. And one of the people who signed on to our appeal was the city councilman out of Prince George's County, Calvin Hawkins. And we had already been in conversation with him about cultural educational exchange program with the whole southern region of Africa. But because of the Afro-descendant movement in Venezuela, we were going to prioritize incorporating Cuba's experience and Venezuela's experience into the process. So things of that nature that represent an expansion qualitatively of the traditional solidarity overtures. That's how we feel that this should be remedied.
If I may say something as well, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has opened the opportunity and opened people's eyes. It's revealed, shall we say, the fractures in the system, the strains in the system, the hypocrisy of the systems, the inability of the system to meet people's needs. And of course, what's happening with Cuba, when people there's been articles that have been played in what I like to call a monopoly media, what people call the mainstream media that has either had to acknowledge what Cuba is doing with its medical missions, or has tried to basically ride them. And I think one of the things that's emerging, and this is linked to our Saving Lives campaign, which is a call for medical cooperation and collaboration in Cuba, including the sharing of medical expertise, including things like COVID-19 and a new medication, other medical treatments that Cuba has developed. And so we have had success. For example, Richmond City Council in California unanimously passed a resolution basically calling for Cuban medical collaboration and cooperation. There's a resolution in the state legislature of Minnesota that's actually calling for this kind of medical collaboration and so on, that's just been put forward. In Canada, we had a call from the Southern Chiefs Organization of Manitoba, which are indigenous peoples, what we would call Native Americans, we call First Nations, that are calling for this. And so there's this growing understanding and realization of what not only of Cuba's international medical solidarity, medical internationalism, but that Cuba perhaps represents, given all the propaganda that this is the so-called best system we live in, that Cuba represents an alternative, right? And so I think these are one of the things that are opening people's minds, right? When we focus on what Cuba is doing in terms of medical internationalism, that this is opening people's eyes to actually join the struggle against the blockade against Cuba. Last point I'd like to make, in Canada, we have a support the Cuban Medical Internationalist Brigades. And despite the fact that people are stuck in their homes, despite the fact that these are financially uncertain times, and despite the fact we couldn't organize physical events, we raised over $31,000 very quickly, and that's already gone off. We're getting ready to send that to Cuba. So this demonstrates the conditions exist to raise consciousness and support for Cuba.
Thank you for that. Is there anyone else that would like to answer or say anything in regards to that last question? Okay, so we'll move on to
Kennedy.
I'm sorry?
Kennedy? Chris.
Yes, absolutely.
No, I just thought it's just something that crossed my mind that maybe what we could consider doing is also to, just as an outcome of this webinar, to support the call that has been made for the Cuban medical brigades to be considered for the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know, just a thought that, we could make as part of an outcome of this webinar.
That would be awesome. Wow, yes, absolutely.
There's actually a petition going around for that, yeah. Okay.
If you have more information about that, Isaac, please share in the chat for others to get involved and learn more about that. And that's, an honor and absolutely beautiful. So is there anyone else that does have a question in regards to, or wanted to answer that question? All right, so we'll go on to our next one. So we have one that says interferon, antiviral medicine, is blocked by US BDS on Cuba. This medical blockade is life and death for not only Cubans, but all nationalities. Is there any way to have WHO speak on interferon capacity in this pandemic? So maybe this one could go to our ambassador if you have any words on what's going on as far as the World Health Organization and what they're saying in regards to interferon. Or anyone else?
Well, the World Health Organization is to coordinate, also to promote any drug. That you need to have a protocol, a procedure that have different phases. So they are not going to promote a particular drug from a particular country. So they are more careful on this issue. But we are having a exchange with other countries where they are using our products. As you already mentioned, I would like to add that in the protocol for treatment of COVID-19 that we are using 18 different drugs. 15 of them are producing in Cuba by our biotechnology industry. So COVID-19 also shows us that, and this is something that we owe to Fidel Castro, that he always have a long vision. And even during the special period of Cuba, he decided to create this biotechnology industry that now support our health system. So despite that, the strengthening of the blockade to Cuba, in particular, just right now, I think that the blockade to Cuba is more stronger than ever. We are in a position to fight the COVID with our own resources, because we have sovereignty in this area. So this is also a very important issue in the fight of the COVID. We are not relying. We only use three drugs that are not producing in Cuba. The rest, I think, our national industry can produce it. Even interferon 2B that have been very popular and have been used for many years, but now for the treatment of COVID have been very popular. Also, we are in the capacity not only to produce for the national necessity, but also to sell to other countries if they want it. To sell, sometimes we are providing to them, to other countries.
Okay, thank you for that. Is there anyone else that has anything to say in regards to this? There is another question that you may be able to answer, Ambassador Ana Silvia. Someone did ask, how can we stand together to mobilize international support for Cuba and end of the illegal blockade with nations in the world supporting the end of the blockade to vote in the UN every year? How can we mobilize now using COVID-19 leverage to end this?
I think that what is important is to continue to raise awareness of the impact of the blockade to the Cuban people. The blockade, like you say in other seminars, kills people. Maybe because of the Cuban system, we diminish the damage, but when you cannot buy a medicine to treat a particular disease, to treat a kid with cancer, and maybe we have to use an alternative drugs, not the best one. Despite that the government of Cuba made all the efforts possible to find the best one, and maybe we pay the triple of the price for that medicine in order that the particular kid have the treatment. But when you cannot provide this medicine to a patient, this patient could die. So blockades kill, despite that the official from the US government said that they are not intend to harm the Cuban population. The blockade harm the Cuban population, because when you deny the possibility, or you are tracing and follow all the books that brings oil to Cuba, is to deny production in Cuba, so we cannot produce food, we cannot have electricity, we cannot have water. When you goes after any transaction, financial transaction to buy food, so you are intending to harm the Cuban population. Why? Because your objective is that through to create in the Cuban population desperation, that they claim to the government of Cuba that because of the government is the situation that they are suffering. And this policy has been it's a policy of the United States government since the very beginning of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution and when the blockade to Cuba starts. In the memorandum of understanding of Mr. Mallory, if I don't remember wrong, it's very clear what are the purpose of the blockade to Cuba, that is to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. So the blockade really kills people, and what you need to know, it's continue to mobilize the international community to raise awareness of this issue, but also go to your a congressman or to your in your constituency also that to mobilize this action in the U.S. Congress, that because at the end the blockade is a law, and only by another law you can lift the blockade. It's not an executive order. Well, this president never going to take any order on this issue. But if we want to lift the blockade, you need that the Congress approve a law. So that is important, that the mobilization of the international community to make pressure also on the U.S. government. And particular, we have to take advantage of this situation, because now in this situation where we have to solidarity, we have to cooperate. Solidarity is the word that we need to use. We have to put political difference aside. We have to put ideologies aside and come and work together in order to defeat the COVID. The government of the United States decided to resort and to even to continue strengthen the blockade, even to those product that goes directly to the fight against COVID.
Thank you for that. Is there anyone else that would like to say anything? Okay, these are awesome questions. So we'll go on to our next one. It is directed towards Shay, but this is open to everyone. How can we mobilize all professionals who graduated in Cuba to express solidarity through material forms? If this could be done, significant resources could be mobilized. Can there be an ambiguous campaign to set up a tax campaign payable to Cuba through Cuba embassies?
Well, I think our experience in South Africa is that I mean, outside of the Friends of Cuba Society, we also have an organization of an alumni of students that graduated in Cuba. And what they normally do is, I mean, they also collect some monies voluntarily. And because we've got Cuban doctors that are working in some of our rural areas, the monies that they collect, they organize some cultural activities and exchanges, which involves these doctors, because these doctors are placed in rural areas, and at times they are single families that are staying all over the place. So these graduates would, especially July 26, they organize these things. And just get those Cuban doctors together to, just to have a bit of fun and do some salsa and other things there. But I think there could be other ways to exploit this. We are toying with an idea in South Africa that the South African government, through a facility they have in the Foreign Affairs department, which is called the Solidarity Fund, to put monies aside that would be used at the discretion of Cuba, but for purposes of youth and children advancements and the arts in Cuba. So we mooting the idea and we're engaging the officials in the department, and there seems to be some buy-in into it, and maybe in the next year or so, we should be able to see movement in that direction. That is at least our experience in South Africa, and as the Friends of Cuba, and also as the South African Communist Party. You know, we've been trying to push that, getting computers and those kinds of things, identifying primary schools in Cuba, and sending these kinds of materials down there. Thank you.
Yes, this is Obi Egbuna. Yes, one of the things that we were talking about going forward in our conversations is we have the African Union in Washington, D.C., and they have a United Nations office as well in New York. But also because we're in Washington, D.C., at some point, we want to call a meeting with the different representatives of the different regional bodies, be it the Southern African Development Community, COMESA, NAPAD, and with the National Conference of Black Lawyers and the National Bar Association being in observance, we can look at a practical way where we can specifically finance, create a pool for Cuba's medical work on the African continent. That we feel that is definitely very important, and it is the biggest threat to the United States Agency for International Development's methodology, how they use humanitarian aid as political bribery. So this is something that we've been talking about for a minute. When I was in Zimbabwe 4 years ago, it was one of the discussions that we had, because Zimbabwe is the only nation under imperialist sanctions that Cuba is functioning in. So that country is severely compromised in the medical arena. So these are some of the things that we had definitely talked about. But of course, and if you remember, when the Millennium Fund was first created, when Kofi Annan reached out to Comandante Fidel about HIV/AIDS, he asked would Cuba have a financial contribution to make. And Comandante Fidel had to remind him about the blockade, but he said that if the resources were ever available, Cuba would dispatch a 4,000-member HIV/AIDS brigade to the African continent that would remain in Africa until HIV/AIDS is eradicated. And we can also look at this in the scheme of the fact that non-communicable diseases have become the #1 killer of the human being. Cancer, strokes, heart attacks, that type of thing. So we feel, because we have a Pan-African focus to our work, yes, we will continue to push for the Henry Reeves Medical International Brigade to come to the United States to deal with the current pandemic. But that should not be done in isolation from intensifying our efforts to look at how we can begin to create a resource pool to deal with the challenges on the African continent.
Okay. Is there any other panelists that would like to say something in regards to?
Are we getting close to wrapping it up?
Yes, yeah, we are. We have a few questions, but there are some. Yeah, my next one was going to go to all the panelists. Isaac, I know that you wanted to answer this one. There is a question saying, why did the Black militant Robert Williams of Radio Free Dixie and the Revolutionary Action Movement and writer of the book Negroes with Guns find it necessary to leave his exile in Cuba and move to China?
Yeah, and I think that's sort of kind of linked to another question about remittances and racial divide in Cuba. I think one of the important points is that if one reads early on is that we talk about Cuba solidarity with Africa, but there was also solidarity in the African-American liberation struggle. People such as Leroy Jones, who became Amira Baraka, wrote about going to Cuba, wrote about the inspiration they took from Cuba, and so on. And one of the strongest supporters of the Cuban Revolution have been African Americans, have been people of African descent, and people who understand that Cuba hasn't solved all of its problems, right? But when Robert Williams arrived, and these are complex questions because Cuba faces aggression from the United States when he was there. At this time, the Sino-Soviet split was developing, and so on, right? And Robert Williams, for a variety of reasons, himself, because he didn't think Cuba was dealing with the race question as front on as it should be, and so on. He left Cuba and he ended up in China, right? But he did receive training in Cuba. And some people may not remember Robert Williams. Robert Williams formed the Deacons for Self-Defense. Even before Malcolm X, he was advocating armed self-defense against the Ku Klux Klan and others. There's a famous picture of him and his wife in Cuba firing guns and so forth. We know that other Black revolutionaries like Huey Newton and others found refuge in Cuba. We all know about Assata Shakur, who's lived in Cuba, and the late now departed Nehanda Abedion, who passed away a little while back and so on. So Cuba has always had this kind of interaction where people went to Cuba, and somebody like Assata Shakur herself said she understood that why revolution wasn't a magic wand, that it was going to solve all of the particular problems, that it was going to erase the hundreds of years of the legacy and direct material impact of colonial domination by Spain, that was going to erase the neo-colonial domination by the United States, that was going to erase the fact that Cuba is part of the southern part of a predominantly capitalist world. She understood that, but what she also articulated was the revolution itself created the conditions by which these problems could be tackled and solved. And so there's been a lot of stuff that's been written about race in Cuba. And so, but I have a chapter in my book. There's stuff that's been written by Esteban Morales and so on. But one of the things that's interesting is the Cuban Revolution since 1986 has run an affirmative action policy and has taken this stuff head on. There's a famous speech by Fidel in 1986 to the Third Congress of the Communist Party. And then there are other speeches and talks about this policy. And even now, under current President Miguel Diaz-Canel, there's been an open, commission or program to tackle these particular issues, representing what Cuba still needs to do on this issue. But more importantly, getting back to some of these issues, the blockade itself is the biggest impediment for Cuba's social development. It's the biggest impediment to Cuba actually being able to tackle many of these particular issues. Remittances was one of the questions that was raised, which is money coming from abroad. And when this happened, the Cubans knew this was going to create inequalities, right? But what were they supposed to do, right? And Fidel himself talked about this as walking back on a road that they never thought they'd ever have to walk back on, right? But what Cuba is doing is trying to preserve, and I don't want to spend too long time on, but trying to preserve the fundamental conquest of the revolution while trying to create a space by which they can further deepen their project of social justice and human dignity. It's a complex question that the Cubans are engaging with, and I wish I had more time to talk about it, but I think it's important to understand that there's all sorts of other external factors operating on Cuba that make it very difficult to solve some of its very difficult problems. But what Cuba has been able to accomplish in the face of an unrelenting imperialist war waged against it by the United States is truly amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Is there anyone else that would like to answer as well? Okay.
Before concluding, I'd just like to underscore something that Andrew Pulley raised, and to put what we're trying to do in historical perspective and what he was calling for. It's important to remember that 100 years ago, there was a pandemic, influenza pandemic in the United States, 1918, 1919, far worse than anything that's happening at this moment. But it was also the time when the working class in the United States went to the streets in a way it had never done before. Mass protests. There was a general strike in Seattle, Washington. So in other words, the class struggle doesn't go away when there's a pandemic. And fighters before us have pointed the way forward, showed how indeed we can come out creatively, however we want to do, I think, what Andrew was calling for.
Okay. Is there any closing comments? So we're going to stop the Q&A. We're sorry that we're not able to get to everyone. There's so many great questions, and I feel like so much of what we've discussed today was just so informative, and it just connected a lot of people together and a lot of organizations together. So I'm going to ask the panelists if you have any closing comments. We can start with, if you want, Ambassador Ana Silvia, if you would like. Yes, I see your hand there.
Yes, I'm going to be brief. It's late, and just again, I would like to recognize all the panelists, all the organizers of this webinar. It was a fantastic exchange of view. I would like to thank you for all your long-standing support to Cuba. We are going to continue doing what we are doing, and I think that the Cuban Revolution stands stronger than ever. For us, internationalism is part of our principle of foreign policy. I always like to say that internationalism is in our DNA. So we are continue doing that, even despite that the strengthening of the blockade against Cuba. And we are not doing that because for recognition, we are doing that out of conviction. So this is the message that I would like to leave to you. And again, thank you, because if the Cuban Revolution stands now and we are passing more than 60 years of struggle, it's not only because of the resilience of the Cuban people, but it's also because of the solidarity movement towards Cuba. So thank you again.
Thank you. And we'll pass it on to Shay, if you had any closing remarks, comments.
No, thank you very much. Well, also just to echo the words of the ambassador, to thank everybody, the organizers. It has been a very excellent exchange. And my parting shot is solidarity is not an act of charity.
Okay, thank you for that. Franz, Franz Walter, if you wanted to, close remarks, you're muted. Oh, you're muted. We can't hear you. Sorry. Oh, Franz, you're muted, so we can't hear anything that you're saying.
Okay,
there you go. Now we can hear you.
Okay. No, I'm thinking that this kind of discussion, we have to open it, not only to the people who are convinced the necessity of putting an end to the blockade, but I think we have to open this kind of discussion to the general public, and opening to the universities, to different places, because there is a vision on the main media, but we can use other media to open a discussion with the unions, with different groups that they have another vision of Cuba. And we have to use also, I think, in this kind of debate, what is happening really in Cuba. What is the impact really of the embargo? Because it's necessary to open it to the global public.
I agree. Thank you for that. Isaac Samey, if you wanted to say any closing comments.
No, I'd just like to say thank you, Cuba, for your example. Gracias a Cuba para su ejemplo. Un mundo mejor es posible. And thank you.
So we have, I think we still have Obi, if you wanted to say any closing comments as well.
I would be, everybody be on the lookout for the mass emphasis, positive action, and creativity youth brigades mini documentary that should be out by the weekend. And you will be hearing from us about this push for Africa and the world thanks Cuba, cultural and artistic tribute in recognition of the Cuban people and revolution, in the spirit of following up. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I see that we have our brother Walumo, if you wanted to say any closing remarks as well.
Yes, on behalf of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, we thank you all for having us participate. And we look forward to with anyone
that is doing work in support of the Cuban Revolution. It is a matter of principle for us that we have to unite with all the forces of progress and revolution that are supporting Cuba. And we thank you very much.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so we do have a save the date with Danny Glover Talks Cuba. Danny Glover in conversation with Jose Cabanas, the ambassador of Cuba to the United States, about US and Cuba relations, COVID-19 and other topics. That's going to be happening on Tuesday, June 16th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. You should hopefully, since you registered for this, you will probably be a part of a list that they'll be able to send this to you as well. But just keep that in mind that there is the save the date talk with Danny Glover on June 16th. And I am so thankful on behalf of myself as well as my colleagues who put this together. So thankful for all the panelists and all the attendees for joining us tonight in solidarity with Cuba and furthering our work that we all individually do and collectively do to help, get rid of the blockade that the US has illegally against Cuba, as well as shining a light on the medical internationalism that is so key and vital right now in the world and what we're going through. So again, we give thanks and we're so thankful. And please, we have so many links that are in this chat. Books, please stay in contact. You can also see more of the work that's going on at www.us-cuba-normalization, which is all one word, .org. Again, that's us/Cuba-normalization.org. And you can find more information in all of our organizing events there as well.
And thank you, Kennedy and August.
And I'd like to extend special thanks to Kennedy, who has far more Zoom skills than I do. And Allison, too, in the background, who's played an important role in this.
Allison.
And the more than 290 people who attended.
At one point, more on Facebook as well. I think it was
fantastic.
And while it's much later for Chris, because it's very early in the morning for Chris in South Africa, being in Atlantic Canada, it is almost midnight for me. So, so it was an honor being on this panel with so many wonderful people.
Same here.
Absolutely.
Bye now.
Right, and there is more information about how we can be in solidarity and continue the work that Cuba is doing. There's a website there, as well as some documents and information about what all they're doing in regards to COVID-19 and the pandemic that's happening in the world. So please just check it out, stay in contact, and we hope to see you all again on June 16th in all future programs.